thanks for having me. It's great to be here. The weather is very interesting. It sort of changes its mood a lot. But other than that, it's great. Is the projector working? Cool. I'm just going to wait for the projector to be on. Cool. All right, cool. So I guess as I wait for that to happen, I'll just give you a little bit of a background. So I'm developing a city in Zambia for about 100,000 people. We are doing about 10,000 residential plots. So we sell land, we don't sell homes. And the idea is that the people who buy the lots of land then build their own homes. And then we also have allocations for about 7,000 apartments that we intend to develop over time, and over 200 acres that we've allocated for education purposes, so a university, 8 schools, along with a business park, which is supposed to function as the business district for the community. So effectively, it's meant to be a self-contained little city. So what we're doing is we're effectively creating all the infrastructure ourselves from scratch. So we're building the roads, we're building the wastewater, we're building the water reticulation systems, we're building the distribution grid for electricity, we're building water reservoirs, so lakes, to hold surface water to supply the city with water.
Is there any way we can help with the projection?
Pardon?
Help with the projection?
Yeah, it worked before.
Yeah. I'll go get the video guy.
Yeah, so what we sort of did is somewhat unorthodox in that we decided that we would hire all the talent to actually build out all this infrastructure on our own. So we don't contract to anyone. So we have our own civil engineering team, and the reason is it's much cheaper. So the state in Zambia builds out road, for example, for about $300,000 for 1 kilometer. We do it for about like $50,000. So there's a lot of reasons why it's expensive. There's a lot of rent seeking, but generally, contractors also price in margin. We don't. So we've had to build out all the competencies to sort of figure this thing out. Yeah.
Sorry.
Anyway, in any case, so my background is that I'm actually a finance major. So when I went to college, I studied finance. I started a tech startup in London around 2010 with a bunch of friends of mine. We raised some angel money for that, about 30K. And then we burnt out, and so I was a little bit depressed. I didn't know what to do with myself. So I decided, you know what, I'm not English. I'm going to go back to Zambia and figure it out from there. So I went back to Zambia and started working in the pension fund industry as an analyst, so helping manage pension fund money, so placing it in bonds, in real estate, equities, and that sort of thing. And as part of my job, I had to do quite a lot of research because I was responsible for all the econ research. So that was on my desk. And it became pretty clear to me that there was this acute housing shortage in Zambia, as well as a very large demographic problem, which is the fact that our largest city is growing by 5% per year, population-wise, which is extremely high growth. So the population at the moment is about 3 million people. It's going to be about 5 in the next 15 years. It's going to be 10 million people by 2050. It's going to be potentially 20 million by 2100, which is a significant growth by any measure. But our municipalities in Zambia, as is the case in many African countries, don't have the financial capacity to actually manage a lot of this growth because they are extremely ineffective. And so it became clear to us that the best intervention to sort of solve for this would be to create new towns to help manage the excess capacity as far as population is concerned, and help the municipalities deal with the capacity problems. And so we've been doing that. Initially, our strategy was pretty formal in the sense that we decided to go out to institutional money and say, hey, we're doing this project, this is the feasibility for it, give us some money, and this is what your return will look like, because the IRRs are actually pretty good. They were like upwards of 30%. But they were like, you're building a city? No, So we were like, okay, we actually do like the project, and we have the land because we owned it. It was a ranch we bought as a family for about $100,000 18 years ago. And so like, okay, what's the downside? We'll just do it. And so we decided to start bootstrapping it. So the question was, how are you going to sell, bushland with the promise that it's going to be a city? And so we spent a lot of money building nice, pretty renders to convince people that we're going to build a metropolis. And the marketing worked. So our thesis for marketing was basically sell it like it's FMCG, right? So it's like lollipops. So we're putting out spreads in the newspapers, ads on TV, like in prime time almost every day. And it worked. People sort of got intrigued and started buying lots of lands from us. And so some days would sell like 90 stands in a day. It's like a lot. And we were selling these on payment plan terms. Basically, we're providing vendor finance to our buyers. So we effectively created a financial instrument to enable our buyers to afford the land, because interest rates in Zambia are extremely high. So upwards of like 30% for a mortgage in some instances for like 20 years. So like you're paying for the same thing like 5 times by the time you're done. And so people couldn't afford to buy spot, right? So no one has the savings to do so, only the elite. And that's not enough of a market to sort of build a city. And so we decided to disintermediate the banks by creating our own bank, effectively. And it worked, so hence the volume in sales. So we're selling these lots of land for something like $300 per month for the cheapest one, on initially 5-year terms with escalations each year, so it gets more expensive to adjust for inflation. And people were reasonably happy with it. And that created effectively a debtor's book for us, so basically a book of receivables that we then used to start financing the infrastructure. So we've been using the cash flows from that to basically do everything we're doing in a very phased manner. So we open up a phase within the city, pre-sell it, and then give ourselves 5 years to sort of finish it off and move on to the next one. So yeah, that's basically the background as to how I got to where I'm at. I alluded to the population dynamics in Zambia. It's more or less the same across Africa. So right now, sub-Saharan Africa has a population of, give or take, 1.5 billion people. The UN estimates that by 2100, that will probably look like 4 to 5 billion people, which is going to be about 40% of the world's population, which is like insanely big. And all these people will be, don't have a place to live, basically, because the cities aren't big enough yet. And the ones that exist were planned for significantly smaller populations. So Lusaka, for example, which is where I live, was planned by the British in the colonial days for 100,000 people, right? 100,000 British people, okay? It wasn't planned for 3 million people, okay? And so there's a lot of traffic congestion. Municipal services are scant, so everyone has a do-it-yourself sort of mentality to sort of like creating infrastructure. So if you buy a lot of land in sort of the emerging parts of these large cities, you have to drill your own borehole well, right? You have to have your own soakaway and septic tank to deal with your waste. You then have to go to the national grid and say, hey, I bought that little piece of land over there, and I need you to take electricity to me. And so that's how it's been scaling. And it's not very sustainable because everybody's then poisoning the groundwater, and it's not really a healthy way for any city to develop. And so what I think will happen over time is that private cities, or rather private developers, will likely be the more common phenomena in Africa, largely as a consequence of necessity. Like I mentioned, municipalities do not have the money, right? And they also tend to be very ineffective. So they'll spend a lot of money doing all these consulting studies, feasibility studies. 10 years later, nothing really has been done, and like a ton of babies have been born. And it just doesn't work. Whereas if you are a private actor, you have an incentive to be fairly quick and fairly efficient with how you utilize your capital. So I think this is a trend that we're going to be seeing more and more in Africa. It's already emerging. Several large city developments being worked on by private actors. Mark mentioned Rendeva. They're probably the larger, I'll probably call it transnational developer in Africa. You've got a huge and ambitious project in Lagos, Nigeria, called Eco Atlantic. So they're basically building an actual island. So they beat the seasteading guys to it, I think. Yeah, but it's in Lagos. And if you've been to Nigeria, I think you know what I mean. Okay, Google it. But in all seriousness, it's something that's happening across the continent, and I think it has to be taken seriously. The primary challenge, though, is, in my opinion, how do we make these things somewhat more sustainable beyond just disintermediating municipalities, because there's broader problems, and I think that's where governance comes to the fore. You have to have an actual governance stack that can actually solve for all the issues that Africa is unfortunately associated with. So rent-seeking behavior, ineffective policy frameworks to enable businesses to thrive. But in my opinion, that's only part of the solution. Along with everything else everybody has said, I think I largely agreed with everything that Elaine, for example, said in his keynote about labor mobility and things of that sort. But more recently, the thing that has been on my mind a lot more is the fact that perhaps within the context of Africa, the Hong Kong model might be the more, I think, sustainable approach to developing cities versus, say, the Shenzhen, because cities exist within macroeconomic contexts, right? And so whether you build a charter city or not, to the extent that the charter city is a satellite town or is beholden to the local macroeconomic winds, so to speak, it will thrive or decline with those winds. as is the case, for example, even with me. So when I first started this project, the exchange rate in my country to the US dollar was about 5.5, we call them kwacha, to $1. As of yesterday, it was like 11, okay? This is 4 years. At some point, inflation hit 25%. Almost got a heart attack at like 27, seeing all these things happen. And you sort of scratch your head asking yourself, well, our business is actually going to emerge that are even hosted in the city, right? And speaking to some of the guys at Rendeva, that's clearly been an issue for them. So they've got a project in Zambia called Roma Park, and they've been marketing the business park for the last, I want to say, 4 years, with very little progress because the local environmental factors just don't support it. And there are a special economic zone, actually. And so you are then left to wait for FDI to emerge, which may also never emerge because you're also competing with other locales for the said FDI, right? So the question is, how do you solve for that? And I actually think that Balaji is onto something in his sort of thesis. I think part of it goes to the heart of what a city actually is, which is it's also a nexus of culture, right? It's not just an economic engine or a political engine. It's a place that people actually identify with. You want to live there because perhaps you like the lifestyle, you like the value system. There are these very normative reasons why people tend to sometimes relocate to some place. And then the second thing is oftentimes people relocate purely because of the desire to be in a place where the perceived opportunity exists. So if you think about why people in Europe all those years ago decided to get onto ships and come all the way here, right? Not knowing what they would find or contend with, it was opportunity. It's the same reason why people left the East Coast to sort of navigate their way to the West Coast, right? It was seeking opportunity. And that happened not just here, but it happened in South America, it happened in Africa, it happened in Oceania. It's happening today with migration from North Africa into Southern Europe. People just want opportunity. And if you can provide a means to enable that, I think that's part of the issue. And I think that speaks to them creating an identity for a city. And so with that being said, and going back to my point on the interest rate environment, I think that's part of the issue. So at a very broad level, I think the global financial system is actually somewhat broken in that you've got surplus capital here, right? And in places like, say, Japan, where it's earning next to zero on bonds. And then you've got places like Zambia and other places which aren't that unstable, all things considered, where capital, not in real terms, but in nominal terms in their currencies is at 30%, for example, for a bond, right? That to me seems rather inefficient. If capital is flowing much more freely, much more liberally, I think these issues would be largely solved for. But that calls for like a globalized or internationalized currency in a sense. And I think that's what potentially crypto could help solve for. Because you have a lot of value that's found its way into the crypto market, so to speak, like what, sub $200 billion market cap for assets which hardly anyone uses and aren't completely fungible everywhere in the world. And yet people believe in it, right? But there's no underlying asset creating income for these holders of this said currency. So my thesis is that if one was to create a locale, let's call it a special administrative area, like a Hong Kong style governance system, which is basically a free city or a charter city within a sovereignty. So it's not completely independent from its sovereign mother, so to speak. It's part of this broader political structure, but is semi-sovereign, right, like Hong Kong is. This said city could have its own currency, and that would then insulate it to some extent from whatever's happening outside of its borders. If that currency is a crypto, which is globally traded, that gives said city access to a global pool of people who could invest in its infrastructure through bond issuances, for example. Those bonds then finance public goods, right? Bonds could then also be used to create a wholesale market, a wholesale lending market, that is, right? Whereby this, let's call it a monetary authority, on-lends said funds from bond issuances to smaller banks or directly to individuals for mortgages, right? And to the extent that in this said city, you had a requirement that any mortgage holder must have a server rack or in their home, which the bank basically rents from them. And that basically then gives them a crypto income to service the crypto mortgage. You've either partially or fully solved for home affordability suddenly. So you have a market for long-term assets and liabilities in a crypto, right? Where none would have existed, where people would have basically no other alternative. And so there is an incentive to use said currency in that particular environment. And then the question is, who owns this entity, right? The city, that is. I'm playing around with the idea that you'd probably tokenize the equity stack. So you have very broad ownership of the equity stack. So basically your shareholders hold token as opposed to shares. And millions of people potentially earn an income from the taxes that said city collects from its residents, and said taxes pay for said mortgages, mortgage bonds, for example, that are issued, or bonds rather, for infrastructure. And so you sort of start creating this economic structure, which might be the beginnings of, I think, real-world application for crypto, in my opinion. And it also creates this anchorage for densification of crypto use, which actually then also makes it more likely that people will be using crypto in everyday life, at least in this one particular area. And speaking now to the issue of identity, right? A lot of people have voted with their money that they like the idea of crypto. So I imagine that if so many people are using it in a real-world context, it creates an incentive for developers and other high-skilled people to sort of relocate to this environment to start building applications for this, right? And so you then start importing capital, both human and financial, into said city, and it potentially becomes like the New York or the Shanghai or the London of crypto, purely because people sort of, A, already believe in it, B, can use it there, and C, it sort of created this identity for itself. It's sort of like the reason why people would leave Wisconsin and go to LA, dreaming that they'll become a movie star when the odds are they'll probably fail. But people did it anyway. And so it's not a very well-defined idea just yet, but it's something I've been thinking about. And the main reason is because I've got the battle scars of having to see an exchange rate devalue by 60%, and I don't like being beholden to leaders, I think, are low IQ, but that is the situation I find myself in. And I think the way you sort of solve for that is you create your own system. And so people sometimes ask me what our business model is, and I think it's civilization. And so that's what we're trying to do, is trying to create a context in which we can actually advance Africa by potentially enabling it to leapfrog certain development phases that other people have taken perhaps 30 odd years to do, and do it maybe in like 10, and then replicate that over and over and over. So the long-term idea is to build out a network of these Hong Kong-style cities. And so speaking now again to the issue of the demographics, in Africa, like I said, you're going to have a situation where you've got 5 billion people potentially by 2100. more than half of those will be living in cities. So assuming we get to the stage where we've got 60% of people, 50% of people living in cities in Africa, that's going to be 2.5 billion people plus living in cities in Africa. And that's over 2.5, that's more than double the existing population of Africa today, right? So those cities need to be built somehow. And if they aren't built, well, Africa will be exporting people, okay? That's what will happen, and it's already happening. And that's going to destabilize, potentially, continents, because those will be huge waves of immigration that the world just not isn't prepared for. I mean, you can see what's happened in Germany with just 1 million Turkish people. Africans don't play, so you don't want to have 5 billion Africans at your doorstep. I know because I'm an African. So yeah, so that's the idea. So my thinking is that if at least 10% of these new city residents live in private enclaves like the one I just described, that will be about 500 million people. No, that'll be 250 million people, sorry, living in private cities, right? Assuming those cities have a GDP per capita of, say, $25,000, you're looking at trillions of dollars of GDP. Okay, and so to me, as a business opportunity, I don't think there's anything like it that's ever existed. I think it's worth doing, but it's very hard. It's not very straightforward because you have to solve for so many different problems at the same time. It's not as simple as building, say, a Venmo where the use case is just one thing. You're solving for education, solving for health, solving for infrastructure, solving basically for all the things that politicians typically pretend they can solve for, but doing it better than them, right? So I think it's possible. I would like to imagine that I'll succeed. I don't know. Thus far, we've been cash flow positive since we started. We built a debtors book of roughly $30–40 million, and we've collected just under 10 of that, so we still have runway. And so our model, I think, has proven that it's financially feasible. The longer term issue is how you actually make it more of a catalyst, right, for the broader change, and how you also solve for the much more difficult issue of the financing problem for your residents, because like I mentioned, we're selling land. We're not selling finished homes. And it'll be much harder for us to sort of do those two things at the same time, because just solving for the land development thing isn't easy. You sort of have to become an expert in all sorts of obscure things, like how to tar a road. But, you know, at the end of the day, you sort of have to solve for the mortgage issue as well. And so, in my opinion, anyone looking at this needs to seriously consider that. If you intend to build homes, you have to consider the fact that you're actually going to be laying out significantly more capital. And then you also have to consider that you'll be contending with the local currency risk. I just mentioned the devaluation, right? So if I was investing in US dollars, I'll then either have to require my buyers to pay me US dollars in rents, or alternatively get a swap or some other derivative to sort of help manage that risk. But all that does is that it makes it a much more expensive proposition for the end user. And so that's why that hasn't necessarily scaled. And you had situations like cities being built in Angola, which were empty for several years because nobody could afford them, right? And so that's why I like the idea of potentially using crypto as part of the solution to this big problem. I think that basically covers all the bases, I think. Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah. Thank you.